The early years of the 19th century were, honestly, a time of great uncertainty for the young United States. A fragile nation still finding its footing, looked out upon a world dominated by Great Britain and Napoleonic France. This European war did not stay confined to the Old World. Its waves crashed upon American shores. The primary source of this tension was found on the high seas. Britain, with its powerful Royal Navy, enforced blockades and trade restrictions, choking off commerce and hurting American merchants. This was a direct challenge to the American ideal of free trade. Worse still was the practice of impressment. British warships boarded American merchant vessels and seized sailors. They claimed deserters, but often the men were American citizens. It was an affront to American honor and sovereignty. Imagine a young man from Boston or Baltimore sailing under the American flag, suddenly pressed into service on a British ship, thousands of miles from home. Each seizure was a fresh wound spread in taverns and newspapers. On the western frontier, conflict brewed. Settlers pushed into Ohio, Indiana, and beyond, clashing with native tribes. Tecumseh Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, began organizing a confederacy, arguing the land belonged to all tribes. By the spring of 1812, the calls for war had reached a fever pitch, echoing through the halls of Congress, amplified by the impassioned speeches of the war hawks. President James Madison, a brilliant architect of the Constitution but a reluctant warrior, found himself caught between rising public anger and America's military unpreparedness. For years he tried diplomacy, embargoes and economic pressure to force Britain and France to respect American neutrality. Those measures backfired, crippling the American economy. Pressure to act became immense. The nation's credibility was on the line. On June 1, 1812, Madison sent a message to Congress outlining grievances against Great Britain. He spoke of the plunder of American commerce, the thousands of sailors impressed into foreign service, and the warfare renewed on our frontier. He asked whether the United States should remain passive under these usurpations. It was a somber, formal step toward a conflict that would test the young republic. The debate in Congress was fierce and deeply partisan, revealing a nation far from united. The vote to declare war on June 18, 1812 was one of the closest in history. The House voted 79 to 49. The Senate followed 19 to 13. The division fell along regional and party lines. Democratic Republicans led by the war hawks from the South and West were overwhelmingly for war. The Federalist Party in New England was vehemently opposed. Their livelihoods depended on maritime trade and they feared ruinous conflict with Britain's navy. With the declaration of war, American military strategy quickly focused on a single ambitious goal, the conquest of Canada. To the war hawks and many military leaders, it seemed like a simple proposition. Canada was sparsely populated, many of them former Americans, might even welcome the invaders as liberators. Former President Thomas Jefferson famously declared that the capture of Canada would be a mere matter of marching. This optimism, however, would soon collide with poor planning, logistical nightmares, and determined resistance. The American plan called for a three-pronged invasion, aimed at striking key points along the vast Canadian border. The first thrust, led by General William Hull, marched his army from Ohio toward Fort Detroit, intending to use it as a base for an invasion of Upper Canada. He was a timid and indecisive commander, haunted by the fear of being cut off from his supply lines and of the Native American warriors allied with the British, led by the formidable Tecumseh. After a brief and hesitant foray into Canada, Hull retreated back to the safety of Detroit. There, he was brilliantly bluffed by the British commander, General Isaac Brock, who paraded his smaller force, including Tecumseh's warriors, in a way that made it appear much larger. Terrified, Hull surrendered his entire army on August 16, 1812, without firing a single shot in defense of the fort. It was a humiliating and shocking defeat. A second American invasion attempt, aimed at the Niagara frontier, fared little better. In October 1812, American forces under General Stephen Van Rensselaer crossed the Niagara River and attacked the village of Queenston Heights. However, the battle turned when New York militiamen, standing on the American side of the river, refused to cross into Canada. Without these crucial reinforcements, the American troops who had crossed the river were overwhelmed and forced to surrender. The failure at Queenston Heights was another devastating blow to American morale. While the American army was stumbling through one disaster after another on the Canadian frontier, a different story was unfolding on the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Here, the tiny United States Navy, vastly outnumbered by the colossal British Royal Navy, achieved a series of stunning victories that, honestly, electrified the nation. The American Navy was a collection of well-built, powerful frigates, manned by well-trained and motivated volunteer crews. These ships, like the USS Constitution and the USS United States, were often larger and more heavily armed than their British counterparts of the same class. They were designed not to fight a fleet battle, but to win one-on-one duels, and in the early months of the war, they did just that. The most famous of these encounters occurred on August 19, 1812, just 3 days after the shameful surrender of Detroit. The USS Constitution, under the command of Captain Isaac Hull, a nephew of the disgraced general, engaged the British frigate HMS Guerrière. In a fierce, close-range battle, the Constitution's superior firepower and the crew's expert gunnery shattered the British ship. At one point, British cannonballs were seen bouncing off the thick oak hull of the American vessel, prompting a sailor to exclaim, "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron!" The nickname Old Ironsides was born, and with it, a national legend. When the Guerrière surrendered, a shattered and dismasted wreck, it sent a shockwave through the world. The invincible Royal Navy had been beaten. This victory was not an isolated incident. In October, the frigate USS United States, commanded by Stephen Decatur, captured the HMS Macedonian. While the frigate duels captured the headlines, another crucial naval struggle was taking place on the Great Lakes. In 1813, a young American naval officer named Oliver Hazard Perry was tasked with building a fleet on Lake Erie to challenge British dominance. He famously reported his victory to General William Henry Harrison with the simple, iconic message, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." By 1814, the war in Europe had really taken a decisive turn. Napoleon Bonaparte was finally defeated and exiled, which, freed up thousands of battle-hardened British troops and the full might of the Royal Navy to be redirected toward the conflict in America. The character of the war was about to change dramatically. No longer would it be a distant, secondary concern for London. Great Britain now planned a major offensive to punish the upstart republic. One of the primary objectives was to strike directly at the heart of the American government. So, in August 1814, a British force of about 4,500 veteran soldiers, commanded by General Robert Ross, landed in the Chesapeake Bay and began an audacious march inland toward Washington, D.C. The American defense was, honestly, disorganized and chaotic. A hastily assembled force of mostly untrained militia was thrown together to block the British advance at Bladensburg, Maryland, which was just a few miles from the capital. The Battle of Bladensburg, fought on August 24, 1814, was a complete and utter fiasco for the Americans. The militia, facing disciplined British regulars who were veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, broke and fled almost immediately, in what became derisively known as the Bladensburg Races. The road to Washington was wide open. Panic gripped the city as government officials, including President James Madison, scrambled to evacuate. That evening, the British Army marched into a largely deserted Washington, D.C. in retaliation for the American burning of York, what we now call Toronto. Earlier in the war, the British set about putting the city's public buildings to the torch. They burned the Capitol, they burned the home of Congress, they burned the President's house. The interiors of these iconic structures were gutted by flames, their sandstone walls blackened with smoke. But as the fires raged in Washington, one small act of foresight saved a priceless piece of American heritage. First Lady Dolly Madison, showing remarkable courage and composure, refused to abandon the president's house until she had secured the rescue of a full-length portrait of George Washington. While the Capitol burned, a sudden, violent thunderstorm erupted over the city, dousing many of the flames and forcing the British to curtail their destruction. After their successful raid on Washington, the British forces turned their attention to their next target, the city of Baltimore. Baltimore was a much more valuable prize than the symbolic capital. It was a major commercial hub, a notorious haven for the American privateers who had been preying on British shipping throughout the war. The British commanders were determined to lay it in ashes. But Baltimore was not as unprepared as Washington had been. The city's defenders, under the command of General Samuel Smith, had worked tirelessly to build impressive earthworks and fortifications to defend the landward approaches to the city. The key to Baltimore's defense, however, lay in its harbor, which was guarded by the formidable star-shaped bastion of Fort McHenry. The British attack began on September 12, 1814. General Ross's troops landed and began to advance on the city, but they were met by determined American militia at the Battle of North Point. In the fighting, a pair of American sharpshooters managed to kill General Ross, a serious blow to British morale. The British advance stalled, and they were confronted by the strong American defensive lines, which they were hesitant to assault directly. The focus of the attack then shifted to the harbor. On the morning of September 13th, a flotilla of British warships began a relentless 25-hour bombardment of Fort McHenry, hoping to force its surrender and open the way for the Navy to attack the city. A young American lawyer and amateur poet named Francis Scott Key watched the bombardment from a small ship in the harbor, where he was being temporarily detained by the British after helping to negotiate a prisoner release. Throughout the day and into the night, he saw the bombs bursting in air and the red glare of the rockets fired by the British fleet. He could only watch and wonder if the fort's defenders could withstand the terrible onslaught. The fort was armed with a massive garrison flag, measuring 30 by 42 feet, which had been specially commissioned so that the British would have no trouble seeing it. When dawn broke on the morning of September 14th, Key strained his eyes to see through the smoke and mist, and then he saw it. By the dawn's early light, the enormous American flag was still there, waving defiantly over the walls of Fort McHenry. While much of the war's focus was on the Canadian border and the Atlantic coast, a brutal and consequential conflict was also being waged in the American South. It was a war between the United States and British Allied forces, but it was also a brutal civil war among the Creek Nation. The Creek Nation was divided between a faction that wanted to accommodate American expansion and a faction known as the Red Sticks, who were inspired by Tecumseh's call for resistance. The Red Sticks, angered by settler encroachment on their lands, launched a series of attacks in 1813, culminating in the Fort Mims massacre, where they overran a stockade and killed hundreds of American settlers and mixed-blood Creeks. The massacre at Fort Mims sent a shockwave of fear and outrage across the southern frontier and prompted a swift American response. The task of crushing the Red Stick uprising fell to a tough, ambitious, and utterly relentless Tennessee militia general named Andrew Jackson. Jackson was a man forged by the frontier, known for his fiery temper and iron will. He pursued the Red Sticks with grim determination through the harsh wilderness of what is now Alabama. His campaign was plagued by shortages of supplies and mutinies among his troops, but Jackson refused to be deterred. He was a stern disciplinarian who would not hesitate to put a man to death for desertion, yet he also inspired fierce loyalty among the men who followed him. The decisive engagement of the Creek War came on March 27, 1814, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. About 1,000 Red Stick warriors had fortified themselves in a heavily defended encampment on a peninsula formed by a bend in the Tallapoosa River. Jackson, commanding American militia regular soldiers, allied Cherokee warriors, allied Creek warriors, launched a full-scale assault. The battle was a brutal and bloody affair. By the end of the day, nearly 900 of the 1,000 Red Stick warriors were dead. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend effectively shattered the military power of the Creek Nation and ended their resistance. In late 1814, even as diplomats were meeting in Europe to negotiate an end to the war, the British launched their most ambitious military operation yet, a massive invasion aimed at capturing the vital port city of New Orleans. Control of New Orleans meant control of the entire Mississippi River Valley, the commercial artery of the American West. A British victory there could have dramatically altered the post-war map of North America. The man tasked with defending the city was the newly promoted Major General Andrew Jackson. When he arrived in December, he found the city's defenses in a state of disarray. With his characteristic energy and iron will, he declared martial law and set about constructing a formidable defensive line. Jackson's army was a motley but determined force, a true reflection of the American frontier. United States Army Regulars militia units from Tennessee, militia units from Kentucky, militia units from Louisiana, a contingent of free African-American soldiers, Choctaw warriors, and even a band of pirates led by the charismatic Jean Lafitte. Jackson had pardoned them in exchange for their cannons and their expertise with artillery. Jackson chose his ground carefully, positioning his men behind the Rodriguez Canal, an old dry moat that ran from the Mississippi River to a nearly impassable cypress swamp. The British force, commanded by General Sir Edward Pakenham, was a formidable army of over 8,000 veteran soldiers, many of whom had defeated Napoleon's finest troops in Spain. They were confident, perhaps overconfident, in their ability to sweep aside Jackson's ragtag defenders. On the foggy morning of January 8, 1815, Pakenham ordered a full frontal assault on Line Jackson. It was a catastrophic decision. As the British soldiers advanced across the open muddy plain, they were met with a devastating storm of artillery and rifle fire from the well-protected Americans. The disciplined British lines were torn apart. Wave after wave of attackers were cut down. The battle was a stunningly one-sided victory for the Americans. Unbeknownst to everyone on the battlefield, however, the war was already over. American and British diplomats had signed the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium 2 weeks earlier, on December 24, 1814. Though strategically meaningless, the Battle of New Orleans had a profound and lasting impact on the American psyche.